You stand in a courtyard where the sun burns too cleanly for mercy. The air smells of limestone dust and milk left too long in the heat. Somewhere a child is crying, but not from pain. It's the sound of someone trying to remember a name that is no longer theirs. Before we descend into Egypt's oldest silence, tell me, where are you watching from? Cairo? São Paulo? Lahore? Across continents, our screens glow like votive lamps, each carrying a face that could have belonged to one of these children. Tap the heart, leave a trace in the dust. Let the past see how far its echoes have traveled. Now, the courtyard. A girl stands barefoot on pale stone, her knees trembling beneath the linen wrap that once marked her as a merchant's daughter. The morning is merciless. Light drips down the walls like molten gold. A priestess, veiled in white, gestures to the man holding the bronze blade. The sound it makes is soft, almost reverent, as it slides across the child's scalp. Each stroke gathers a small curl, black and glistening, that falls to the ground and turns gray in the dust. 9-year-old Nefertari watches her reflection in the polished bowl of water beside her. The face looking back is smaller than she remembers. Behind her, her father stands still, his hands clasped in apology he'll never speak aloud. His debts had grown beyond grain, beyond cattle, beyond redemption, and the temple had been generous enough to offer a solution. "Your daughter will serve the goddess," the scribe had said, dipping his reed into ink. A life for a life. A balance restored. The papyrus still bears his mark, a single curl of black script that turned a living child into an entry in an account book. The temple economy of Egypt thrived not only on offerings of gold or livestock, but on bodies pledged, promised, or taken. Every major shrine had its human holdings, its staff of perpetual servants known as temple children. Officially, they belonged to the gods. In practice, they sustained the machinery of faith, grinding grain, weaving linen, tending altars, carrying water until their backs bent like reeds in the Nile wind. For families like Nefertari's, this was not considered cruelty. It was transaction sanctified by piety. To offer a daughter was to gain divine favor and erase debt in the same stroke. But not every child entered the temple by choice. Far to the south, where the cataracts roared through Nubia, another story unfolded. Mutmua, 8 years old, woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. Egyptian soldiers had come before dawn, their chariots cutting the silence open. The campaign was swift. Her village, unfortified, had no time to flee. When the sun rose, the men were bound, and the children herded together like sheep. They were marched northward for weeks, their skin blistering under the desert light. By the time they reached Thebes, they were no longer captives. They were resources. The scribes tallied them with the precision of accountants, marking age, condition, and potential function. The younger ones went to the temples, the older ones to estates or workshops. "Her name?" a priest asked. "She had one," the guard replied. "It's gone now." The priest nodded. "Then she is Mutmua, she who is born of the mother. The goddess will remember what the world does not." The girl did not understand the words, but she understood the gesture, the shaving of her head, the tightening of linen across her body, the cool scent of myrrh rubbed into her skin. When she was led into the temple hall, she saw the others. Dozens of girls, identical in their quietness, their eyes wide with learning how not to look back. Inside these walls, the children's days moved with ritual precision. At dawn, they cleaned the altars. By midday, they wove linen for statues or polished votive cups until their arms ached. In the evenings, they were taught songs, hymns that praised the goddess for her mercy, her justice, her unending love. But what did mercy mean to a child who had forgotten the sound of her mother's voice? Nefertari learned quickly that silence was survival. The priestesses spoke little, their authority absolute. Once, when a new girl tried to run, her punishment was swift. Isolation, fasting, and the shaving of brows, a mark of defilement. The others learned not to dream of escape. Sometimes the high priest would walk through the hall, inspecting the girls as one might inspect statues. "The goddess sees purity in obedience," he would say. "You are her breath made flesh. Years later, records from temple archives would reveal the scale of this system. Contracts preserved in ostraca listed children pledged by families in exchange for tax relief. Royal decrees celebrated the offering of foreign captives as signs of divine favor. Even the tomb inscriptions of priests boasted of the hundreds who served beneath their care. The bureaucracy was flawless. The compassion was absent. Underneath the chants and incense, another Egypt existed, a network of hidden transactions where faith became the language of control. The Nile carried not only silt and life, but also the forgotten tears of those offered to the gods. When Nefertari turned 12, her father came once to see her. He had grown thinner. The gold amulet at his throat no longer shone. "You look well," he said, voice trembling. "I serve the goddess," she replied as she had been taught. He tried to smile, but his eyes stayed fixed on her shaved head, on the way the light slid across her scalp like water. Then he bowed and left without looking back. That night, the temple lamps flickered as the wind rose from the desert. Mutmua lay awake in the sleeping chamber, staring at the ceiling painted with stars she no longer believed in. Somewhere, a child whispered a song, one of those hymns about the goddess's mercy. Outside, the Nile sighed against its banks. The world went on, as it always did. But beneath that silence, something waited. Something vast, unspoken, and ancient as the stone itself. The children had become ghosts long before anyone realized they were gone. No inscription speaks of the silence inside. The temple's outer walls blaze with gods and victories, but within the air thickens with a quieter devotion, the kind that scrapes the self clean. To enter here is to unlearn who you are, one ritual at a time. Morning in Thebes begins not with song, but with the sound of water. The purification court is a rectangle of pale stone, its pool reflecting a square of hard blue sky. Rows of girls kneel by the edge, linen folded at their waists, heads lowered. Steam rises from the water, carrying the scent of lotus and lime. The priestess moves down the line, silver bowl in hand. "Wash and be made worthy," she says. Each girl is stripped and examined under the pretext of ritual cleansing. The gestures are practiced, clinical, yet ceremonial. Hands trace collarbones, shoulders, thighs. Every surface is searched for blemish, impurity, imperfection. Beneath the litany of prayer, the inspection is absolute. The sacred and the profane blur until neither remains distinct. When the bowl reaches Nefertari, she shivers despite the heat. The water, poured from shoulder to heel, is cool as metal. She's told to keep her eyes open, to witness her rebirth. Around her, the chant swells, dozens of voices blending into one rhythmic drone. By the time it ends, she no longer feels like she has a body, only obedience. This is how the architecture of erasure begins, not in walls or doors, but in language, gesture, ritual repetition. After purification comes renaming. A scribe sits cross-legged on a mat, his reed pen tapping against the inkstone. One by one, the girls step forward. Their given names, those whispered by mothers, sung in lullabies, are read aloud once, then struck through on papyrus. A new name is chosen from the temple register. Mutmua, he says to one. Asetemheb, to another. And when Nefertari stands before him, "You are Neferu and Mut now, beauty of the mother." The sound is strange in her mouth. The syllables taste of dust and surrender. Around her, the priestesses recite a blessing. The goddess claims what was born of woman. Flesh becomes symbol. Will becomes worship. From this moment forward, every utterance, every movement is monitored. The girls are forbidden to speak their birth tongues. To whisper in Nubian, Canaanite, or even the dialects of Lower Egypt is considered defilement. Words themselves become borders. At night, the silence is complete. In the sleeping chamber, dozens of bodies lie arranged like offerings, heads shaven, arms crossed over chests. Sometimes in the half-dark, a soft hum rises, an old melody carried from a life before. But it dies quickly. Punishment for memory is swift. One evening, a young woman named Satni is caught singing to herself. The tune was a cradle song, barely audible above the rustle of linen. Yet the priestess heard. "Whose name do you sing?" she demands. "My mother's," Satni whispers. The next morning, the girl's tongue bears a thin line of ash, burned as a mark of impurity. She is forbidden to speak for a full moon. The others learn. They forget faster. Inside the sanctum, the air is thick with incense and submission. The walls bloom with painted gods, Osiris, Hathor, Amun, watching with unblinking perfection. At the center stands the veiled idol of Mut, mother of creation. Before her, the girls kneel during the divine marriage rite. A priest's voice echoes through the chamber. As the goddess is eternal, so too shall her brides be bound. A garland of papyrus is placed around each neck, a symbol of union. A contract is read aloud, binding them not to men but to divinity itself. The temple now owns their labor, their time, their silence. They are wives of the goddess, yet their vows carry no return, no end. Nefertari feels the reed necklace press into her skin, light as breath, heavy as fate. When the priests chant her new name, she cannot tell if it's a blessing or a burial. Days blur into one another. The temple calendar governs every act: rise at dawn, purify, serve, sleep. Even the stars seem to obey. Those who falter are sent to the inner chamber where penance is performed in solitude. Mutmua is taken there once. Her transgression: she laughed when a novice spilled oil. For 3 nights she is kept in the cold antechamber beside the sacred pool. She is made to repeat her vows until her voice breaks. When she returns, she no longer laughs. What did it mean? This system so vast it could erase a childhood with ink? To what extent did the architects of faith believe that obedience was holiness, that silence was devotion? Perhaps they did not see cruelty at all, only order. Still, something in the air remembers. The limestone walls are scored with faint, unrecorded scratches, tiny marks beneath the painted reliefs. Scholars would later find them, fragments of names, simple words in foreign tongues. Mutmua, Satni, Nefertari, a rebellion carved 1 grain at a time. The architecture of erasure was never flawless. Even in the deepest chambers, the self found ways to survive. In a look, a hum, a carved line no taller than a fingertip. One night, a sandstorm moves across Thebes. Dust slips through every crack, coating the altars, the statues, the sleeping faces of the consecrated. The lamps flicker and die. For the first time, darkness fills the temple completely. In that moment, the silence changes. It is not the silence of obedience anymore. It is the stillness before something awakens. Outside, the desert moans like a living thing. Inside, a breath catches. A single voice begins to whisper, not in the language of the goddess, but in the lost tongue of a mother calling her child home. And somewhere deep in the walls, the gods begin to listen. The air inside the storeroom has not moved for 3,000 years. Dust lies thick as sleep upon the walls, upon the clay jars and the fragments of broken idols. A single shaft of light falls through a crack in the ceiling, catching on the faintest trace of letters carved into limestone, letters that once tore through silence like a blade. I came from beyond the first cataract. My mother's name was Amanatore. I never forgot. The words are shallow, desperate, uneven. They are not prayer. They are proof. The temple scribes never recorded these names. To them, such inscriptions were contamination, a human stain upon divine stone. Yet the stones remember. By the late reign of Amenhotep III, the temple's inner courts had become a world sealed unto itself, where devotion was indistinguishable from obedience and obedience from ownership. Every rite, every breath was measured. Among the most guarded of these ceremonies were the sacred unions, rituals said to renew the goddess's power through her chosen vessels. At sunset, the processions began. Oil lamps flickered against painted ceilings. Incense coiled upward in spirals that blurred faces into halos. The high priest, draped in gold-threaded linen, recited verses declaring his flesh a conduit of the divine. Before him stood the women, heads bowed, wrists marked with the sign of Mut. The ceremony was framed as cosmic harmony, the god descending to unite with his earthly bride. But what happens when faith becomes a disguise for violation? No scroll dares answer. Yet in the margins of an ostracon discovered centuries later, a scribe had written a single line beside an inventory of temple servants. Some wept at dawn. The goddess heard, but did not answer. Among them was Neferu and Mut, the girl once called Nefertari. She had grown into her vows, her silence polished smooth as alabaster. Yet in that stillness, defiance gathered like dust. She began teaching the younger girls fragments of old songs, disguising rebellion as ritual chant. Each note carried a forbidden word: mother, river, home. One evening, during inspection, a priest paused near the weaving hall. On a half-finished cloth, he noticed a strange pattern, alternating knots forming what appeared to be the symbol for Ankh, life. But closer study revealed something else: the ancient Nubian sign for remember. The punishment came swiftly. The women responsible were bound in reed rope and brought before the assembly. The high priest's decree was ritualized cruelty, dedication to the desert. At dawn, the procession began. Witnesses described it as an act of purification, the offering of souls to the horizon where gods dwell. In truth, it was abandonment. Each woman was left at the edge of the western sands, where the wind buried footprints faster than they could be made. No one returned. The temple recorded it as the goddess reclaiming her servants, and yet the carvings continued to appear, in storerooms, beneath stairwells, behind plaster walls. They were not prayers, but fragments of identity, etched in stolen moments with shards of pottery or bone. A single word, sometimes two: daughter, freedom, Amanatore. Mutmua was the first to carve her mother's name. She did it in a corner of the grain chamber, just beneath a relief of the goddess's open hands. The guards thought her kneeling in prayer. When she finished, she pressed her forehead against the wall and whispered, "Now she knows where to find me." The temple erased these traces again and again, scraped them clean, plastered them over, but the hands that carved them always returned. Archaeologists would later find over 40 such inscriptions in Thebes alone, each hidden in places of routine labor: water cellars, laundry halls, the undersides of lintels. Together they form a chorus of resistance more enduring than any hymn. Why did they risk everything to write? Perhaps because speech was forbidden, and the act of carving was the only remaining language of the living. The scratch of limestone became heartbeat, the mark itself a rebellion against disappearance. Late in her years, Neferu and Mut, once Nefertari, was placed in charge of ritual linens. Her hands, though worn, still trembled when she touched the smoothness of new-woven cloth. One night, she dipped her finger in lamp soot and wrote a message across the hem of a veil meant for the goddess. "I remember the river. I remember the wind." When the morning came, she washed it away with water from the sacred basin. But soot leaves ghosts even when scrubbed clean. Under the right light, the words would shimmer faintly, as though refusing extinction. Death came quietly in the end. There was no ceremony, no tomb, no offering jar. The women who had served the goddess were buried together beyond the necropolis, their resting place unmarked. The temple called it returning to the source. Centuries later, when the desert shifted and swallowed the last of the painted walls, a team of excavators uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the ruins of Karnak. Inside, amid jars of grain and broken amulets, they found the limestone shard, its surface etched with that single message from beyond the first cataract. The script was uneven, the hand untrained, but the meaning was unmistakable. "I came from beyond the first cataract. My mother's name was Amanatore. I never forgot." It was not a plea. It was a declaration. Against a system that sought to erase every trace of self, one woman had left her testimony in stone. Now, as light touches the carved letters again after 3,000 years, the silence they once inhabited seems to shift. The air hums faintly, as if the walls themselves are exhaling after an eternity of holding secrets. And in that breath, the dead speak, not as servants, not as saints, but as women who refused to disappear. Somewhere in the dark of the ruins, a whisper lingers, barely audible beneath the sound of shifting sand. I never forgot.